Welcome back, everyone. Volume 22 is another goated volume because it contains one of Lenin's most famous works, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. But before we get there, I should make some mention of other texts that are of note in this volume. The first one is a rather lengthy examination of the capitalization of American agriculture in New Data on the Laws Governing the Development of Capitalism and Agriculture, Part 1, Capitalism and Agriculture in the United States of America. Lenin argues that America was undergoing a transition from the slave-owning latifundia, his word, to small commercial agriculture. However, the expropriation of small-scale agriculture was advancing as the proportion of owners to the total number of farmers was declining steadily, while the growth in the number of farms lagged behind population increase, particularly in the northern states. Lenin was so fascinated with the development of capitalism and agriculture in America because he wanted to use it to prove a point to his fellow Russians who argued that the same could not be done or could not be true in Russia, as though agricultural production was somehow immune to capitalization, which was an argument that many people made. Of minor note is Lenin's introduction to Nikolai Bukharin's pamphlet, Imperialism and the War Economy. He praises Bukharin's analysis that capitalism has entered a new high stage thanks to the growth of exchange and large-scale production internationally, to the scale that production is so large that monopoly has replaced competition, enabled by the flexibility of finance capital. This argument sounds familiar. It obviously is. Bukharin is one of my favorite theorists and one that I think Lenin himself learned a lot from. Most of the article is a prolonged rant against Kautsky, who argued that what came next was not socialist revolution like the Bolsheviks were arguing, but ultra-imperialism. And Lenin complains that such a position evinces a wavering of Marxism. Quote, Marxism on credit, Marxism in promises, Marxism tomorrow, end quote. Because it fails to fully register the moment they were living through. However, it seems to me that Lenin was so convinced of the cataclysmic situation of war, World War I, that the continuation of capitalism seemed almost impossible for him. If we reflect on the post-World War II order and today, one could argue that Kautsky was, to a certain extent, right. Ultra-imperialism is a thing. By far the largest and probably most important for the past few volumes is Lenin's Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. Without diving too much into the text, there's a lot that can be said, but not enough time to cover the entire text. Lenin essentially historicizes capitalism in his time through a chronology that sees, one, the partitioning of the world into locales of raw materials, resources, and colonies, and two, the exportation and extraction of capital from these parts of the world. And he uses the example of railways to make the case that tie industries like coal, iron, and steel in their relation to cartels, monopolies, syndicates, trusts, banks, and a financial oligarchy. Lenin's conclusion in that work is that capitalist wars are inevitable as long as private property and the means of production exists. It's important to note that these arguments come at a time of acute tension with Europe's socialists and the split of the International. The purpose of the text, given the time that it was written, was to prove to the defensists of the Kautsky type that they were living through a very particular and sensitive moment, one poised for social revolution. A response to the Junius pamphlet, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, written in secret by Rosa Luxemburg, which argued that, quote, international wars are no longer possible in the epoch of unbridled imperialism. Lenin addresses this directly and says that it's not exactly true. Positioning dividing lines like that are too definite when in fact any phenomenon might be transformed into its opposed under certain conditions. A national war might be transformed into an imperialist war and vice versa, was Lenin's point. So he doesn't disagree with her, he's just adding a little bit of nuance. He also says that the idea is further disputed by the inevitability of nationalist wars waged by colonies, and that's an important point. Finally, in the discussion on self-determination summed up, Lenin has an important quote relating to the path of self-determination, which becomes a major thing after the war. He says, quote, "It is impossible to abolish national or any other political oppression under capitalism, since this requires the abolition of classes, i.e. the introduction of socialism. But while being based on economics, socialism cannot be reduced to economics alone. A foundation, socialist production, is essential for the abolition of national oppression. But this foundation must also carry a democratically organized state, a democratic army, etc. By transforming capitalism into socialism, the proletariat creates the possibility of abolishing national oppression." That's all I have for you this month. Until next time, we get to volume 23.